So as young people, you've got one really important and powerful advantage: the right to ask questions. So here's another guy. Let's get rid of, we'll move on from Mao. Oh, I mentioned Einstein. Yes, I mentioned Einstein. There he is with his blackboard. But this guy, Socrates, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, have probably read about him or been taught about him. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher. Why did he die? He lived a long time ago in a very different kind of society from our society, but not everything was different. He was put to death. He was put in prison and he was executed. And the charge against him, and he was an old man at that point, I think he was around 80 years old. The charge against him was corrupting the young. They said he was corrupting young people. But what he was actually doing was teaching young people to think, to ask questions, and to challenge the established truths. So what we would call critical thinking, something that's still not practiced enough in our formal education systems, in my opinion. Socrates was old, he was experienced, and he was wise, but his students were young and full of intellectual energy. And that was an explosive and dangerous combination, something which the authorities then saw as a kind of revolutionary assault on the fortress of that time and the prevailing hierarchy of ideas. Hopefully it's less risky to do that kind of thing nowadays, to ask those questions, but it's not necessarily any easier than it used to be. So how do you begin to change the world? A writer called Aldous Huxley said the following, and this is, you'll have heard this quotation, but probably slightly wrongly. This is the actual quotation. He said, "I wanted to change the world, but I have found out that the only thing one can be sure of changing is oneself." And that, in what we're discussing, is the first step, even though it isn't all that easy. How do you change yourself? How can you be sure your opinions are really your own? And how can you change patterns of thinking which have been reinforced through years of submission to that relentless hierarchy of ideas? How is it possible to think freely at all? You need to start by asking people those questions which are easy to ask, but hard to answer. Why? Why not? What if? Why do you think that? But first of all, you have to ask yourself, why do I think that? But for me personally, that sort of free thinking process happened in different ways and at different times. In many ways, it came about when I moved away from home and began to mix with very different kinds of people. And I realized that I didn't have to or want to think the same as my parents. And by the way, I loved my parents very much, and we never had any big kind of bust up. So it wasn't like that, but it's that I began to think more freely. And I expect the same is true for most people. And what it shows is that the most important factor in developing your own thinking is interaction with other people. So what you're doing here could be a great start. So ask yourself those hard questions, but help yourself by finding and making friends with people who are completely different from yourself, people who think differently, maybe have different views to your own, maybe think the opposite of what you think. Listen to them benevolently. No matter how much you think you disagree with them, and never make the dangerous mistake of equating friendship with similarity. Don't just be friends with people who are like you. Some of my best friends are the people who are most different from me, I must say. Teach yourself to be dispassionate. Take a step back and look at yourself. Look at your views as if you're on the outside. Don't take yourself too seriously, and be prepared to laugh at yourself. Try and put yourself in other people's shoes. Don't let your imagination fail. That's one of my biggest criticisms of so many people these days, is that they forget that they can't imagine what it's like to be in somebody else's position. That's so important. Begin your own private journey of change. Become a traveler. Become a time traveler. But as you get older and hopefully wiser, try never, ever to forget who you are and who you have been. That's what we call authenticity, being true to yourself. And at the moment when you smash down just one brick in the wall of the hierarchy of ideas and reject one prejudice that's not truly your own, then you have begun to change your own small corner of the world. And how long before you can change the rest of the world? Nobody can answer that question, but there's no reason why you shouldn't begin now, today.